"We need to talk," Richard said, his voice oddly formal as he set down his briefcase in our sunlit kitchen. I looked up from the hotel spreadsheets scattered across our marble island, the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating decade-old wedding photos on the wall behind him. Something in his stance, shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly, made my stomach tighten. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Can it wait? The investors' meeting is tomorrow, and these quarterlies are, I'm leaving you, Claire. 5 words, delivered with the same tone he used to order coffee. My pen froze mid-calculation, ink bleeding, slowly into the profit margin projections I'd spent all morning perfecting. What? The question emerged as little more than a whisper, the kitchen suddenly airless despite the gentle hum of our state-of-the-art ventilation system. Richard sighed, loosening his Hermes tie, the one I'd given him for our 10th anniversary last year. "I've been seeing someone, for a while now. Her name is Amber. She's younger, more spontaneous. She makes me feel alive again." The cliché of it all almost made me laugh. Almost. "How young?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, professional training kicking in. Always assess the situation before responding. 15 years running Lake Sapphire Resort and Spa had taught me that much. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. 26. Nearly 20 years younger than his 45. 15 years younger than me. "She's an instructor at my gym," he continued, as if that detail somehow legitimized the betrayal. "It just happened, Claire. You've been so busy with the hotel expansion, working late nights, business trips." As if my career success was the justification for his wandering eye. As if building our luxury lakeside resort from a rundown motel into the premier destination in 3 states was something to apologize for. "How long?" I asked, setting down my pen with deliberate care. 8 months. 8 months. While I was securing the financing for our new West Wing, while I was doubling our business while other hotels in the region were closing, while I was building the life we had planned together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I want a divorce," he continued, pulling papers from his briefcase. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. You can keep the house, but I want half the hotel value. I helped you get started, after all." Helped me get started. What a convenient revision of history. I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. Richard Ellison, who'd been a struggling real estate agent when we met. Richard, whose help consisted of a $30,000 loan from his parents that I'd repaid within our first profitable year. Richard, who'd happily enjoyed the fruits of my labor while contributing little beyond occasional guest schmoozing and relationship building with the golf club across the lake. "Half the hotel," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "It's only fair," he said, placing the divorce papers on top of my spreadsheets. "We built this life together." I looked at his manicured hands, the gold wedding band I'd placed there 11 years ago catching the afternoon sunlight, the same hands that had apparently been touching this Amber for the past 8 months. "Where are you going to live?" I asked, my mind already calculating, assessing, planning, the way it did when faced with any business crisis. "I'm moving in. With Amber. Today, actually. I've already packed my things." He glanced toward the foyer where, I now noticed, 2 suitcases stood waiting. "I'll send for the rest later." Of course he would. Richard, always efficient when it came to his own comfort. "I see." I stood up slowly, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind my ear, conscious of the subtle streaks of silver I'd recently noticed in the mirror. Silver earned from years of 4 a.m. wake-ups to handle hotel emergencies, from endless nights poring over business plans and loan applications, from building something real. "Claire?" Richard softened his tone, reaching for my hand. Across the island. This doesn't have to be ugly. We've just grown apart. You're married to this place. He gestured vaguely toward the lake visible through our windows, where the resort's distinctive blue roofs could be seen peeking through the pines. There's no room for me anymore. I pulled my hand away before he could touch me. I'll have my lawyer review these, I said, gathering the divorce papers without looking at them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Richard looked almost disappointed, as if he'd expected tears or pleas. Perhaps he'd hoped for drama that would validate his decision, confirm I was too emotional, too difficult, justifying his flight to someone younger, simpler. That's it? He asked, brows furrowing. What did you expect, Richard? That I'd fall apart? Beg you to stay? I straightened my spine, summoning the poise that had carried me through countless difficult negotiations. You've made your choice. Now leave. I have an investors' meeting to prepare for. He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. This is exactly why I'm leaving. You're cold, Claire. All business. When was the last time you put us before the hotel? The accusation stung precisely because it contained a seed of truth. I had poured myself into Lake Sapphire, but we had agreed, hadn't we? This was our dream. Financial independence, creating something lasting together. At least that's what he'd said when I'd purchased the dilapidated property 12 years ago, when we'd still been dating. I put us first every day when I built security for our future, I replied evenly. But please, tell yourself whatever helps. You sleep at night, preferably elsewhere, starting now. Richard's face hardened. He reached for his briefcase, snapping it closed with unnecessary force. My lawyer will contact yours. I want my share, Claire. Don't forget who introduced you. To the investors that made this place possible. As if I could forget. Richard's college roommate, Marcus Phillips, whose family had provided our first serious investment after seeing my business plan. The connection Richard never let me forget, though Marcus had long since told me he would have invested regardless. The plan was that good. The location that perfect. Goodbye, Richard, I said simply, turning back to my spreadsheets, a dismissal that made him flush with anger. He grabbed his suitcases with jerky movements. You'll be hearing from me. The front door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through our open-concept lake house, the dream home I'd designed and paid for 4 years ago when the resort first turned a significant profit. Only when I heard his BMW's engine fade down our long driveway did I allow my hands to tremble, the papers blurring as unwelcome tears filled my eyes. I didn't cry for long. There wasn't time. Reaching for my phone, I made 3 calls in rapid succession. To my lawyer, to my financial advisor, and to the resort's head of security. By the time the sun set over Lake Sapphire that evening, Richard's access to our accounts had been severed, his keycards to the resort deactivated, and a security review of our systems initiated. In business, I'd learned to act decisively when threatened. This was no different. The investors' meeting would proceed tomorrow as planned. The West Wing construction would continue, and Richard Ellison would discover exactly what happens when you mistake a woman's dedication for weakness. He wants what? Marcus Phillips's normally composed expression gave way to disbelief as he leaned forward in his chair in my resort office the following morning. Half the resort's value, I repeated, sliding the divorce papers across my mahogany desk. Despite contributing approximately 5% of the initial investment, which was fully repaid within 18 months. Marcus, now head of our investment group and my most steadfast business ally, removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. That's absurd, Claire. Absolutely absurd. It gets better, I continued, my voice steady despite having barely slept. He's claiming his social capital and relationship building were instrumental to our success. Social capital, Marcus scoffed, reaching for the bottled water I'd placed before him. You mean drinking scotch with the golf club executives while you worked 80-hour weeks renovating this place? I allowed myself a small smile, grateful for his loyalty. Outside my office windows, Lake Sapphire sparkled in the morning light. The resort's grounds immaculately groomed. Guests in plush robes moved between the spa building and the lakeside hot tubs. A groundskeeper carefully tended to the award-winning gardens that had become one of our signature attractions. All of this, every flower, every stone path, every thread count decision, had been mine. Richard was always charming, I acknowledged, leaning back in my chair. It served us well in the beginning. Charming doesn't build resorts, Marcus replied flatly. And it certainly doesn't entitle him to half of what you've created. Claire, you transformed a failing roadside motel with 12 rooms into... He gestured toward the window, where the 150-room main building gleamed in the sunlight. This, a world-class destination, with another 50 rooms breaking ground next month. Which brings us to why I needed to speak with you before the investors' meeting, I said, straightening the folder containing the quarterly projections I'd managed to complete despite last night's upheaval. I need to know if Richard's departure changes anything for the investment group. Marcus regarded me thoughtfully, his silver hair catching the sunlight. At 62, he'd become something of a mentor to me over the years, though he always insisted I had taught him more about adaptation and innovation than he could ever teach me. Claire, he said finally, the investment group backed you, not Richard. Yes, he made the introduction, but it was your business plan, your vision, your execution that won us over. Nothing has changed as far as we're concerned. Relief washed through me, though I kept my expression neutral. Thank you. But you should know, Richard is likely to make things difficult. He's always excelled at working a room, spinning a narrative. Marcus smiled thinly. Let him try. Our group isn't composed of impressionable 20-somethings. The dig was petty but satisfying. I allowed myself to enjoy it for a brief moment before refocusing. There's one more thing, I said, pulling another document from my desk drawer. I'd like to accelerate the staff accommodation project. If we're going to fight Richard on the valuation, I want to make sure we're maximizing our workforce stability. For the past year, I'd been working on plans to convert an unused parcel of land into affordable housing for resort employees. Like many tourist destinations, Lake Sapphire struggled with staffing due to the area's high cost of living. The project would both solve a practical business problem and fulfill my personal commitment to creating a responsible business model. Marcus reviewed the revised timeline. Ambitious, he remarked, but sound. Richard opposed this, didn't he? I nodded. He thought it was an unnecessary expense, preferred to keep relying on seasonal workers. Short-sighted, Marcus muttered, making a note in his planner. Typical. We spent the next hour reviewing the quarterly numbers, finalizing our presentation for the full investment group that afternoon. By the time Marcus left to freshen up before the meeting, my confidence had steadied. The business, at least, remained on solid ground. My personal life, however, was another matter entirely. The investors' meeting went precisely as planned. The expansion funding was secured, the staff housing project approved. If anyone noticed my slightly red-rimmed eyes or asked about Richard's unusual absence, they were too professional to dwell on it after my brief explanation of personal matters requiring his attention in the city. I was just collecting my materials when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hope the meeting went well without your better half. Don't worry, I'll take good care of him. Amber. Attached was a photo. Richard and a blonde woman, who couldn't have been more than 25, toasting with champagne glasses, my husband's arm wrapped possessively around her waist. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist looked suspiciously like the one I'd found on our credit card statement 3 months ago. The purchase Richard had explained away as a gift for his mother's 70th birthday. I stared at the image, noting the young woman's flawless skin, her toned arms, her perfectly styled hair. Noted, too, the smug satisfaction in Richard's smile. so different from the restrained version he presented in business settings. This, then, was what he wanted. This uncomplicated adoration. This trophy on his arm. I deleted the message without responding, though my hands shook slightly as I gathered my laptop. Let them celebrate. They had no idea what was coming. He can't possibly think he's entitled to half, Sarah, my attorney and longtime friend, declared later that evening. We sat on my lakeside patio, glasses of wine in hand as the setting sun painted the water copper and gold. It's outrageous. Richard has always had an inflated sense of his own contributions, I replied, watching a pair of loons drift across the lake's surface. And an excellent ability to revise history in his favor. Sarah took a contemplative sip of her Cabernet. At 53, she'd been through her own divorce battle 15 years earlier and had emerged not only intact but stronger, eventually building the region's most respected family law practice. His timing is suspicious, she observed, right before the resort expansion breaks ground, when the valuation is at its peak. I'd had the same thought. He's been planning this, probably consulted with his lawyer months ago. While sleeping, with a woman half his age, Sarah added acidly. Charming. He's already moved in with her, I said, the reality of it still somewhat surreal. She texted me today, apparently wanted to make sure I knew they were celebrating. Sarah's expression darkened. Amateur move. No decent attorney would have advised. That? I doubt they're consulting attorneys for everything, I replied dryly. What concerns me is how far he'll go to get what he wants. Richard knows every aspect of this business. He may not have built it, but he's been adjacent to every decision for a decade. Sarah set down her wine glass, her expression turning serious. What are you most worried about? I considered the question carefully. Aside from the obvious financial implications, information. Richard has relationships with our vendors, our high-value repeat guests, even some staff. He knows our systems, our schedules, our vulnerabilities. Then we need to address those vulnerabilities immediately, Sarah replied, already reaching for her tablet in her designer handbag. Starting with a full audit of your contracts, vendor relationships, and intellectual property. I smiled gratefully at my friend, some of the tension leaving my shoulders. Already underway. I made some calls last night. Sarah nodded approvingly. Good. And Claire, we need to discuss the house. You said he agreed you could keep it? For now, I replied. But I'm not counting on that generosity lasting once he realizes I'm fighting the resort valuation. We spent the next 2 hours strategizing, identifying potential pressure points and developing contingency plans. By the time Sarah left, armed with files and a clear mandate to protect what I'd built, I felt marginally more in control. Standing alone on my patio, watching darkness settle over the lake, I allowed myself a moment of grief, not just for my marriage, but for the future I'd believed in, the partnership I'd thought we had, however imperfect. The plans we'd made for our later years, once the resort was fully established. All gone now, shattered by betrayal and replaced with the grim determination to protect what remained. My phone chimed with an email notification, pulling me from my thoughts. The resort manager needed approval for a staff schedule adjustment. The head chef had a question about the weekend special event menu. The linen supplier wanted to discuss the new order for the expansion. Life and business continued. And so would I. 3 days after Richard's departure, the other shoe dropped. Ms. Ellison, Janet, the resort's front desk manager, appeared in my office doorway, her normally composed expression strained. There's a situation in the main lobby. I glanced up from my computer, immediately alert. What kind of situation? Janet hesitated. Mr. Ellison is here, with a companion. They're checking in. My stomach tightened. Checking in? Yes, ma'am. The Lakeview Suite, reserved under Amber Larson. The Lakeview Suite. Our most expensive accommodation, featuring panoramic views of the lake, a private hot tub on the balcony, and the handcrafted king-size bed I'd personally selected from an artisan in Vermont. "I see," I said, my voice carefully neutral as I rose from my desk. "Thank you, Janet. I'll handle this." As I walked through the resort's elegant corridors, passing original local artwork I'd personally selected and custom light fixtures I'd commissioned, I assembled my thoughts. This was a deliberate provocation. Richard bringing his mistress to my resort, flaunting their relationship in my professional space. The rational part of my mind urged caution. Creating a scene would only reflect poorly on me as the owner. The resort's reputation for discretion and professionalism was sacrosanct, but the wounded human part of me burned with indignation. I paused at the entrance to the main lobby, taking a steadying breath and adjusting my tailored blazer. Through the archway, I could see Richard at the reception desk, his arm draped possessively around a slender blonde in a dress that probably cost more than my resort paid its housekeepers in a month. Showtime. I walked forward with measured steps, a professional smile firmly in place. "Richard," I greeted him, keeping my voice pleasant. What an unexpected surprise. He turned, a flash of uncertainty crossing his features before being replaced with practiced confidence. "Claire, just showing Amber our charming establishment." The blonde, Amber, looked me up and down with a smirk that contained more insecurity than confidence. Up close, she was indeed beautiful, with the kind of youthful glow that comes from good genes and regular Pilates rather than actual life experience. "So you're the wife," she said, her voice higher than I'd expected. "I've heard so much about you." "Ex-wife, soon enough," Richard corrected quickly, tightening his grip on her waist. I maintained my professional smile, turning to the front desk clerk who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Thomas, has Ms. Larson completed her registration?" The young man nodded nervously. "Excellent." I returned my attention to the couple. "I hope you enjoy your stay. Lake Sapphire prides itself on creating memorable experiences for all our guests." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. This clearly wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated. "We intend to," Amber replied, leaning into Richard. "Richie says the Lakeview suite is absolutely magical, though he mentioned the mattress might be due for an upgrade." The petty dig, undoubtedly fed to her by Richard, who had complained about the artisan mattress being too firm, almost made me laugh, as if I would lose my composure over bedding criticism. "We appreciate all feedback," I replied smoothly. "Thomas, please ensure Ms. Larson and her guest receive our VIP welcome package, and perhaps a complimentary mattress topper since comfort is such a priority." Thomas nodded again, clearly relieved I wasn't making a scene. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with our expansion contractors." "Richard, always a pleasure. Ms. Larson, welcome to Lake Sapphire." I turned and walked away, painfully aware of Richard's eyes on my back. Once around the corner and out of sight, I ducked into a staff corridor, leaning against the wall as my composed facade threatened to crack. The audacity, the sheer, calculated cruelty of bringing her here, to the place I'd built from nothing. To parade his young conquest through my professional domain as if... "Claire?" I straightened immediately at the sound of Marcus's voice. He stood at the corridor entrance, concern etched on his features. "Janet told me Richard's here," he said quietly, approaching. "With company?" "Yes," I confirmed, forcing my voice to remain steady. "They've booked the Lakeview suite." Marcus's expression darkened. "Want me to have a word with him? I still technically own 10% of this place. I could make things extremely uncomfortable." The offer was tempting, but I shook my head. "No, that's exactly what he wants. Drama, attention, proof that he can still affect me." Marcus studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Smart. But there are other ways to handle this situation." A slight smile curved his lips. "Ways that maintain our professional standards while ensuring their stay is educational." I raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? A special VIP experience, Marcus replied. After all, as a courtesy to our valued guests, we should show them exactly how much care and attention goes into operating a luxury resort. As he outlined his thoughts, a plan began to form. Not one of petty revenge, but of calm, calculated consequences. By the time we finished our impromptu corridor meeting, my equilibrium had returned, along with a renewed sense of purpose. Richard wanted to play games? Fine. But he'd forgotten who'd written the rulebook for Lake Sapphire Resort and Spa Operation VIP Experience began innocuously enough. Richard and Amber were indeed given our standard VIP welcome package: champagne, artisanal chocolates, fresh, flowers. Their mattress received a luxurious topper. Their dinner reservation at our lakeside restaurant was confirmed for the best table. But then the subtleties began. First, their room's sophisticated environmental system developed a programming error. Instead of the usual 68 degrees Richard preferred, the temperature fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes too warm, sometimes too cool, but never quite comfortable enough for deep sleep. Then there were the service calls, perfectly timed, utterly professional, and completely unavoidable. A routine check of the fireplace safety system, a water quality assessment for the hot tub, a security verification of the balcony doors, each performed by courteous staff during daylight hours, each requiring just enough time to interrupt any attempt at romance or relaxation. The couple's dinner reservation was meticulously honored, at a table perfectly situated to be visible from every angle in the restaurant, ensuring they were on display throughout their meal. The service was impeccable, if occasionally interrupted by staff needing my signature or approval on matters that, strangely, could only be handled tableside near Richard and Amber. Is he furious yet? Emma, our head chef and my close confidant, asked when I stopped by the kitchen to compliment her on the evening's menu. Not visibly, I replied, accepting a taste of her new sauce creation. But I know Richard. His jaw gets tight when he's suppressing anger. Right now, it looks like he could crack walnuts with it. Emma grinned, her chef's whites immaculate despite the dinner rush. Wait until they try to use the hot tub later. Maintenance says the jets will work perfectly, for exactly 7 minutes before needing to reset for safety reasons. I shouldn't have found satisfaction in these minor inconveniences. But after Richard's deliberate provocation, the petty justice felt deserved. Still, I maintained my professional distance, nodding politely when I passed the couple in the resort corridors, but otherwise focusing on my actual responsibilities. The real turning point came the following morning. I was conducting my daily walkthrough of the property when Janet called my cell phone, her voice unusually tight. Ms. Ellison, there's been an incident with Ms. Larson's credit card. I stopped on the garden path, signaling to the groundskeeper I'd been speaking with that I needed a moment. What kind of incident? It's been declined, multiple times. And Mr. Ellison's cards are also showing as problematic. I closed my eyes briefly. This I hadn't orchestrated. Where are they now? I asked, already changing direction toward the main building. In the privacy room off the main lobby. Ms. Larson is quite upset. I quickened my pace, mentally reviewing our protocols for payment issues. Lake Sapphire had clear policies. We were not in the business of extending credit, especially for luxury suites that cost over $1,200 per night. When I reached the discreetly labeled consultation room off the lobby, I could hear raised voices before I even opened the door. Absolutely. Humiliating, Amber was saying, her voice shrill with indignation. Do you know who my father is? This is... She fell silent as I entered, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Richard stood by the window, his back rigid, phone pressed to his ear. Claire, he acknowledged coldly, lowering the phone. I assume you're behind this. I raised an eyebrow, turning to Janet, who stood nervously by a terminal. Behind what, exactly? Don't play innocent, Richard snapped. Somehow you've flagged our cards. This is harassment. I turned to Janet. What seems to be the issue? The front desk manager straightened professionally. Ms. Larson's card was declined when we attempted to process last night's incidentals and today's continued stay. We tried Mr. Ellison's cards as backup, but they're showing a security hold. I nodded thoughtfully, as if this were any ordinary guest situation. I see. Have you offered alternative payment options? Yes, ma'am. Cash, wire transfer, or another card would all be acceptable. Amber made a sound of frustration. This is ridiculous. I have plenty of credit. I regarded her calmly. I'm sure it's just a temporary security measure. Banks are increasingly cautious about luxury purchases, especially in locations different from your usual spending patterns. My bank knows exactly where I am, she insisted, crossing her arms. Richard finished his call, his expression thunderous. There's a hold on my accounts. My lawyer is looking into it, but it appears there's been a freeze placed on our joint assets pending divorce proceedings. Ah, Sarah had moved faster than expected. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, my tone professional but not particularly sympathetic. However, Lake Sapphire does require valid payment for continued accommodation. Richard's eyes narrowed. You know, perfectly well, I'm good for it. As a business owner yourself, you understand our policies, I replied evenly. We cannot extend credit, even to family. Amber looked between us, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension. Wait, did you do this? She demanded, pointing a manicured finger at me. Are you really that petty? I maintained my calm. Ms. Larson, I assure you, I have no access to or control over your personal banking. Now, would you prefer to provide an alternative payment method, or shall we assist you with checkout procedures? The young woman's face crumpled slightly. My other cards are maxed out, she admitted, shooting an accusatory glance at Richard. You said this was covered. Richard's jaw tightened further. It was supposed to be. He turned to me. Claire, be reasonable. You can comp the room for a day while we sort this out. I smiled thinly. That would be showing favoritism, which is against company policy. As you so recently reminded me, you're entitled to exactly half the business value, not special privileges, beyond what any guest would receive. His face darkened with anger. This is childish. No, Richard, this is business. I turned to Janet. Please prepare their checkout documentation. They have 1 hour to vacate the room before we'll need to notify security. You can't just throw us out, Amber protested. Don't you know who I am? I regarded her coolly. You're a guest whose payment method has been declined. Nothing more, nothing less. Richard stepped forward, lowering his voice. Claire, don't do this. It's beneath you. What's beneath me? I replied quietly, is allowing someone who betrayed me to continue enjoying the fruits of my labor without proper compensation. You wanted half this business? Fine, but you'll need to pay for your stay like everyone else. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Richard, the next time you want to make a point by bringing your girlfriend to my resort, make sure your finances are in order first. It's just good planning. The door closed behind me on Amber's. Renewed protests. I walked calmly to my office, closed the door, and only then allowed myself a moment of grim satisfaction. Round 1 to me. By mid-afternoon, the resort grapevine was buzzing with news of Richard and Amber's humiliating checkout. Security had not been needed. My ex-husband was too image-conscious to create a scene. But their hasty departure had not gone unnoticed by staff or guests. I maintained my professional demeanor throughout, focusing on the dozens of actual priorities requiring my attention. The construction permits for the West Wing expansion needed final approval. The staff housing project architect had questions about sustainable materials. 3 wedding planners wanted tours of our event spaces for potential bookings. Life continued. Business thrived, and I refused to be derailed by personal drama. That evening, as I reviewed applications for our head of maintenance position, our current manager was retiring after 15 dedicated years, my phone rang with Sarah's number. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "Did Richard really bring his child bride to the resort and then get kicked out for non-payment?" I sighed, setting aside the promising resume I'd been reviewing. "News travels fast. Small town, big scandal," Sarah replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Please tell me there's security footage." "There might be," I admitted. "Though, I'd never use it. That would be unprofessional." "Of course," Sarah agreed, too quickly. "Completely unprofessional. But hypothetically, was she crying?" "Please tell me she was crying." I shouldn't have laughed, but the tension of the past few days needed release. "Let's just say she was expressing her displeasure very vocally. But Sarah, that's not why I had them removed. The credit hold was legitimate." "Yes, it was," she confirmed, her tone shifting to business. "The judge granted our emergency motion this morning. All joint assets are frozen pending proper accounting. Richard's personal accounts remain accessible to him, but they're apparently insufficient." That didn't surprise me. Richard had always spent to the limit of his means, confident that the next commission or bonus would cover the shortfall. More than once in our marriage, I'd covered his credit card bills when his real estate business had a slow month. "He's already trying to fight it," Sarah continued. "His lawyer called mine this afternoon, demanding the freeze be lifted for living expenses. And I reminded them that Richard voluntarily left the marital home to live with his girlfriend. If he's experiencing financial hardship as a result, that's a consequence of his choices, not your problem." I smiled, grateful once again for Sarah's fierce advocacy. "Thank you." "Oh, I'm just getting started," she replied. "Claire, I've been reviewing the ownership structures and contribution records. His claim to half the resort value doesn't hold water. Yes, he made introductions and performed some relationship management, but that's compensated work, not equity building." I'd known this intellectually, but hearing it confirmed by a legal professional eased some of the anxiety I'd been carrying. "So what's our next move?" "Counterfiling tomorrow. We're offering a settlement that acknowledges his contributions without giving away the farm. 15% of current resort value, payable over 5 years to protect your cash flow during expansion." I frowned. 15% is still millions. "Yes, but it's not half. And the payment schedule protects your operations." Sarah paused. "Claire, I know it feels unfair to give him anything." "No," I interrupted. "You're right. He did contribute, especially in the early years. I just wish that he hadn't turned out to be a walking midlife crisis cliché," Sarah supplied dryly. "Something like that." I gazed out my office window at the lake, now silver, under the rising moon. "Have you seen the photo of her? She looks like she just graduated from college," Sarah snorted. "I've seen it. And trust me, that relationship has an expiration date. The question is whether it expires before or after your divorce settlement." The thought hadn't occurred to me. "You think he's going to leave her? Or she'll leave him when she realizes his accounts don't match his lifestyle promises? Either way, it rarely ends well when the foundation is betrayal." After hanging up, I sat for a long while staring at the lake, contemplating Sarah's words. The resort lights reflected on the water's surface, creating the illusion of stars fallen to earth. This view, this peace, was what had first drawn me to the dilapidated motel 12 years ago. I'd seen potential where others saw only decay. My phone buzzed with a text. "Richard, we need to talk. This freeze is unacceptable. Meet me for dinner tomorrow?" I considered ignoring it, but that would only escalate the situation. Better to maintain communication, however limited. "No dinner," I typed back. "You can meet me at my office. 2 p.m. His response came quickly. "Our office, you mean?" "Fine." I set the phone down, his petty correction oddly reassuring. Richard's predictable need to assert himself, to claim ownership over what he hadn't built, reminded me exactly who I was dealing with, and why protecting Lake Sapphire from his grasping hands was not just business, but personal necessity. As I gathered my things to leave the office, a notification popped up on my computer screen. An application for the maintenance position, submitted just minutes before the deadline closed. Normally, I'd leave it for morning review, but something made me pause. The name at the top of the resume caught my attention immediately. Jason Harlow. Jason had been our very first hire when we purchased the rundown motel 12 years ago. A jack of all trades with an uncanny ability to fix anything, he'd been instrumental in the early renovation work that transformed the property. 4 years into our journey, he'd left to care for his ailing mother in Arizona, a departure I'd understood but mourned professionally, and now, apparently, he was back. I scanned his resume quickly. After his mother's passing, he'd worked at several high-end resorts across the Southwest, steadily climbing the maintenance hierarchy. His qualifications were impeccable, his experience perfect for our needs. There wasn't a system in our resort, from the vintage boiler we'd preserved as backup to the state-of-the-art smart room controls, that Jason wouldn't understand. Without hesitation, I sent an interview request for tomorrow morning, before my scheduled confrontation with Richard. Having Jason's steady competence back at Lake Sapphire would be a significant win, one bright spot in an otherwise turbulent week. As I drove home along the winding lakeside road, I found myself smiling for the first time in days. "The place looks amazing, Claire," Jason said the next morning, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he gazed around the resort lobby. At 48, he carried the same quiet confidence I remembered, though his dark hair now showed distinguished touches of silver at the temples. Hard to believe this used to be the Lakeview Motel. "Some days I can hardly believe it myself," I admitted, leading him through the public spaces toward my office. "Those certain original features remain, including that troublesome north wing boiler that used to keep you up at night." Jason laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "You kept old Bertha? I'm impressed by your sentimentality." "Less sentimentality, more practicality," I replied with a smile. "She's our backup system now, but she's saved us during 2 major power outages." The interview itself was a formality. Jason's qualifications were exceptional, his familiarity with the property invaluable, and his references glowing. By the time we'd finished touring the maintenance facilities and discussing the expansion plans, I knew he was exactly what Lake Sapphire needed. "When can you start?" I asked as we returned to my office. "Immediately," he replied without hesitation. "I've been in temporary housing since returning to the area 2 weeks ago. Perfect timing." "The staff housing project breaks ground next month," I told him. "In the meantime, we have manager apartments available in the East Wing." As we finalized details, I found myself appreciating Jason's straightforward professionalism and genuine enthusiasm for the resort. Such a contrast to Richard's increasingly performative involvement over the years. "One last thing you should know," I said as we concluded our meeting. "I'm in the middle of divorce proceedings. My husband, Richard, you might remember him. The real estate agent," Jason nodded. "I remember." "Ex-real estate agent, current aspiring resort magnate," I corrected dryly. "He's making claims on the business. Things might get complicated." Jason considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "I'm here for the work, Claire, not the drama. Your vision built this place, not his. Anyone who was here in the beginning knows that." His simple vote of confidence warmed me more than I cared to admit. "Welcome back to Lake Sapphire," I said, extending my hand. "The maintenance team meeting is at 4 this afternoon if you'd like to join." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied with a firm handshake. After Jason left, I reviewed my notes for the upcoming confrontation with Richard. Having just hired someone who remembered the true origins of Lake Sapphire somehow steadied my resolve. "Jason, had witnessed the 18-hour days, the hands-on work, the relentless problem-solving of those early years, a reality far different from the revisionist history Richard was now peddling. At precisely 2 p.m., Richard strode into my office without knocking, bringing with him the overpowering scent of his expensive cologne and a palpable cloud of indignation. "This has gone far enough, Claire," he announced, dropping into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his hair freshly cut, but the effect was somewhat undermined by the tightness around his eyes, evidence of stress his carefully maintained appearance couldn't disguise. "Hello to you too, Richard," I replied, calmly, setting aside the vendor contract I'd been reviewing. "I assume you're here to discuss the asset freeze." "You had no right," he snapped. "I was humiliated in front of—" He caught himself, apparently realizing that expressing outrage over his girlfriend's embarrassment to his wife wasn't the wisest approach. "In front of your mistress?" I supplied, keeping my tone matter-of-fact. "That's an unfortunate consequence of poor planning on your part, not malice on mine." Richard's jaw worked as he visibly controlled his temper. "The freeze is excessive, and you know it. I need access to our joint funds." "For what purpose, exactly?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Your personal accounts remain accessible. The freeze only affects joint assets and business holdings pending proper valuation." "I have expenses," he insisted. "Commitments. Such as?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I've put a deposit on a condo in the city. The balance is due next week." "Deposit," I repeated. "For you and Ms. Larson, I presume?" He didn't deny it. "That's not relevant." "On the contrary, it's perfectly relevant. You voluntarily left our home to establish a new residence with your girlfriend. That's a personal expense, Richard, not a marital one." I pulled a folder from my desk drawer. "Sarah prepared this for you, our settlement offer." He took the folder but didn't open it. "I've made my position clear. I want half the resort's value. And I've made mine equally clear. That's not going to happen." I gestured to the folder. "We're offering 15%, payable over 5 years. It's more than fair, given your actual contributions." Richard's face flushed. "My contributions built this place, did they?" I asked quietly. "Tell me, Richard, when was the last time you reviewed a vendor contract, approved a hiring decision, developed a business strategy? Those were all me. Your contribution was schmoozing guests and occasionally attending meetings where you repeated whatever I'd already said, just louder and with more confidence." "That's not true," he protested, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I brought in investors. You introduced me to Marcus, who would have invested anyway after seeing my business plan." I leaned forward. "Richard, I've kept every document, every email, every planning session recording for the past 12 years. I can demonstrate exactly who did what in creating and growing Lake Sapphire. Do you really want to pursue this in court?" For a moment, doubt flickered across his features. Then his expression hardened again. "You're bluffing. And even if you're not, no judge is going to ignore a husband's contributions to a business built during marriage." "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But are you prepared for full financial disclosure? Every account? Every expenditure? Every credit card statement?" I let the implication hang in the air between us. Richard paled slightly. We both knew what a forensic accountant would find. Years of questionable expenses, personal purchases disguised as business necessities, and more recently, gifts for Amber that would undermine his claims of sudden marital dissatisfaction. He opened the folder, scanning the settlement terms. "This is insulting." "It's business," I corrected, "and significantly more generous than what you'd likely receive if we proceed to litigation." Richard snapped the folder closed. "I need time to review this with my attorney." "Of course," I replied. "You have until Friday. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with discovery." He stood abruptly. "You've changed, Claire. You used to be softer, more giving. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. No, Richard. I've always been exactly who I am. You just preferred the version of me you invented in your head, the one who would forever remain grateful that you deigned to support her little business project. That's not— It's precisely what you thought, I interrupted. And now you're discovering, rather inconveniently, that I was never that woman. I built this resort. I secured the financing. I managed the renovations. I developed the business model. And I will not allow you to take credit or profits for work you didn't do. Richard's expression darkened. This isn't over. On that, I replied calmly, we are in perfect agreement. After he stormed out, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the encounter. Richard's reaction had been predictable. Indignation followed by attempted intimidation, culminating in personal attacks when logical arguments failed. What I hadn't anticipated was how little his opinion now mattered to me. Somewhere between his betrayal and this confrontation, Richard had transformed from my life partner into just another difficult business problem to solve. Progress, of a sort. He's going to counter, Sarah predicted later that afternoon as we walked the staff housing construction site. The lakeside parcel had been cleared, survey stakes marking where foundations would soon be poured. Probably around 30%, hoping to meet in the middle. Let him, I replied, pausing to review the site plans with the project manager. We've documented everything. His actual contributions don't justify even 15%, but I can live with it to end this quickly. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. His lawyer must know they're overreaching. The question is whether Richard will listen to reason or let ego drive his decisions. Based on my earlier encounter, I had little doubt which path he'd choose. Richard had always prioritized appearance over substance, pride over pragmatism. It was what had made him an effective real estate agent, all charm and confidence, but a poor long-term business strategist. Either way, we're prepared, I said, signing off on the preliminary excavation approvals. Lake Sapphire continues operations regardless of his tantrums. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed, with a text from Janet. Mr. Ellison in main lobby requesting room key for personal item retrieval. I frowned. What personal items could he possibly have left? Sarah read the message over my shoulder. It's a pretext. He wants back in the building. Why? I wondered aloud, already typing a response. Security escort required for former management. Access. Paul available in 10 minutes. Paul, our head of security, was both professionally intimidating and meticulously courteous. The perfect combination for this situation. Let's find out, Sarah suggested, her lawyer's curiosity piqued. I'd be happy to observe. 20 minutes later, we watched discreetly from the security office as Paul escorted Richard through the resort. Camera feeds showed them moving from the lobby toward the executive offices, Richard gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Audio? I asked the security technician. He tapped a few keys, and Richard's voice filled the small monitoring room. Completely. Unreasonable. Do you know how long I've worked here? This is my resort too, you understand. My ideas, my connections built this place. Paul's response was professionally neutral. I understand, sir. However, protocols require escort for all former management personnel. It's standard procedure. Richard's frustration was visible even on the grainy security feed. I'm not former management. I'm an owner. Technically, Sarah murmured beside. Me, he's neither at this point. We continued watching as Richard led Paul not to the Lakeview suite as expected, but to my office. Once there, he made a show of searching for a supposedly forgotten leather portfolio. What's he really doing? Sarah wondered aloud as Richard examined the credenza behind my desk. Looking for documentation, I realized suddenly. He thinks I keep business records in my office. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Do you? Nothing important, I assured her. Financial records are all secure on our encrypted servers or with accounting. The office contains only current operational documents. On screen, Richard appeared to be growing increasingly frustrated, opening and closing drawers with mounting agitation. "Should we intervene?" the security technician asked. I shook my head. "Let him look. There's nothing there that would help. His case." Eventually, Richard emerged empty-handed, his earlier confidence deflated. Paul escorted him back to the lobby, where we watched him storm out to his car, no leather portfolio in sight. "That was illuminating," Sarah remarked as we left. "The security office. He's desperate for leverage, and willing to manufacture pretexts to obtain it," I added, making a mental note to review all security protocols. If Richard was brazen enough to search my office under surveillance, what else might he attempt? Back in my office, which felt subtly violated after watching Richard pawing through my belongings, I found Jason waiting with the maintenance department's quarterly budget proposal. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting my distracted expression. "Just ex-husband drama," I replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. "Richard was just here, searching my office for forgotten items." Jason frowned. "Should I be concerned about facility security?" His question triggered a realization. Richard knew our systems, not just business operations, but physical infrastructure. In his peripheral role, he'd been present for security upgrades, maintenance overhauls, and technology implementations. "Actually, yes," I said slowly. "We should conduct a full security audit. Richard has extensive knowledge of our facilities and systems." Jason nodded, immediately grasping the implications. "I'll start with access codes and credentials." "When? Did you last update the master systems?" "Not since—" I did the mental calculation. "Not since the East Wing renovation, about 18 months ago." "We'll change everything," Jason promised, making notes. "Override codes, maintenance access, utility controls, server rooms. I'll coordinate with IT and security." His immediate competence was reassuring. "Thank you, Jason. I should have thought of this sooner. Security is easy to overlook until it's needed," he replied pragmatically. "But in my experience, bitter X's and business systems don't mix well." As we reviewed the budget proposal, I found myself appreciating the stark contrast between Jason's substantive contributions and Richard's superficial ones. Jason saw problems and solved them. Richard saw opportunities for personal advancement and exploited them. The realization strengthened my resolve. This was my resort. I would protect it, not just from Richard's financial claims, but from any attempt to undermine or damage what I'd built. 2 days later, we discovered exactly why Richard had been so eager to access the executive offices. "Ms. Ellison?" Thomas from the front desk called my cell phone during the morning inspection rounds. "There's a gentleman here from Excelsior Hotel Group. He says he has an appointment with you and Mr. Ellison." I stopped mid-stride on the garden path. "I don't have any appointments with Excelsior." "That's what I thought," Thomas replied, the confusion evident in his voice. "But he has an email confirmation from the resort address." "Keep him comfortable in the lobby," I instructed. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." As I made my way back to the main building, I quickly searched my calendar and email. No record of any meeting with Excelsior, a mid-tier hotel chain known for acquiring independent properties and standardizing them into their cookie-cutter brand. In the lobby, I found a polished corporate type in his 50s, scrolling through, his phone with the impatient air of someone whose time is extraordinarily valuable. "Mr. I approached with my professional smile firmly in place. "Daniels. Lawrence Daniels, Acquisitions Director." He stood extending his hand. "You must be Mrs. Ellison. Your husband mentioned you might join our discussion." The presumption that Richard was the primary contact and that I was an accessory to the conversation made my blood simmer. But I maintained my composure. "Ms. Ellison," I corrected smoothly. "Claire Ellison, owner and CEO of Lake Sapphire Resort. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. I don't have a meeting scheduled with Excelsior today. Daniels frowned, pulling out his phone. I have a confirmation right here, from Richard Ellison, co-owner, sent Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday, right after Richard's search for his portfolio. He must have accessed my email while in my office. May I see that? I asked, maintaining a neutral expression. Daniels turned his phone toward me. There it was, an email from the resort's general address, signed with Richard's name, but carefully worded to imply my knowledge and approval. The message referenced our preliminary discussions and continuing the conversation about Excelsior's interest in acquiring Lake Sapphire. Mr. Daniels, I said carefully, I'm afraid you've been misled. Richard Ellison is not authorized to arrange acquisition meetings or discussions. Lake Sapphire is not for sale. The executive's expression shifted from confusion to annoyance. I was given to understand that preliminary negotiations were underway. I've flown in specifically for this meeting. I apologize for the inconvenience, I replied, mentally adding another item to Richard's growing list of transgressions. Richard Ellison is my soon-to-be ex-husband. While he previously had a role at the resort, he does not have authority to explore sales or acquisitions. That email was sent without my knowledge or approval. Daniel's annoyance deepened. This is highly irregular. Mr. Ellison clearly represented himself as having decision-making authority. A representation that was false, I stated firmly. Lake Sapphire Resort is not for sale. Not to Excelsior, not to anyone. Now, while you're here, you're welcome to enjoy our facilities. Perhaps lunch at our lakeside restaurant? On the house, of course, given the inconvenience. The executive studied me for a moment, then nodded curtly. I appreciate the offer, but I'll need to make other arrangements. Please convey to Mr. Ellison that Excelsior does not appreciate having its time wasted. I'll be sure he gets the message, I assured him, though I had a much more direct communication planned for my ex-husband. After Daniels departed, I immediately called an emergency meeting with our IT director, head of security, and Jason. Richard's email breach required immediate action, changing all passwords, implementing two-factor authentication, and restricting system access across the resort. He went in through the general resort address, our IT director confirmed after a quick investigation. Probably knew the password from when he occasionally handled guest correspondence. A password I'd neglected to change after his departure, an oversight that now seemed inexcusably careless. What was he hoping to accomplish? Jason wondered as the team implemented security upgrades. Surely he knew you'd discover the unauthorized meeting. He's trying to force my hand, I realized, the pieces falling into place. Create a situation where Lake Sapphire appears to be in play, hoping to either pressure me into selling or establish his authority to negotiate on behalf of the business. Either scenario would strengthen his position in our divorce proceedings. If I sold, there would be a clear cash value to divide. If he successfully positioned himself as an authoritative decision-maker, his claims to substantial ownership would be bolstered. Clever, Sarah commented when I called to update her. Underhanded and potentially actionable, but clever. Can we use this? I asked, pacing my office. He impersonated me, essentially, misrepresented his authority. Absolutely, Sarah confirmed. It demonstrates bad faith in the proceedings and potentially violates the temporary orders prohibiting either party from making substantial business changes without mutual consent or court approval. She paused thoughtfully. But before we escalate to the court, you might consider how to use this tactically. I'm listening. Richard made this move because he's desperate, Sarah explained. The asset freeze hurt him more than he's admitting. He needs money, probably to maintain appearances with his young girlfriend. This clumsy attempt to force a sale suggests he's running out of options. I considered this analysis. So we let him squirm a bit longer? Exactly. Let's adjust our settlement offer downward. say to 12% instead of 15. Cite this breach as justification. See how he responds. The strategy made sense. Richard had overplayed his hand, revealing both his desperation and his willingness to act unethically. Now he would face consequences on multiple fronts. After finishing with Sarah, I composed a carefully worded email to Richard, copying both our lawyers. Richard, your unauthorized access to resort systems and fraudulent communication with Excelsior Hotel Group has been documented and constitutes a serious breach of our temporary agreement. As a result, I am modifying our settlement offer to 12% of business valuation, with payment terms extended to 7 years. Additionally, all resort access privileges have been permanently revoked. Any future attempts to enter the property or access our systems will result in trespassing charges and further legal action. The revised settlement offer expires Monday at 9 a.m. Claire, short, direct, and leaving no room for negotiation. I hit send with a sense of grim satisfaction. Richard's response came within minutes, a blistering phone call that I let go to voicemail, followed by a series of increasingly agitated texts claiming I was being vindictive and unreasonable. I forwarded everything to Sarah without responding directly. By evening, his lawyer had contacted Sarah requesting an extension of the settlement deadline and a return to the original terms. We granted the extension but held firm on the reduced percentage. He's folding, Sarah texted later that night. His lawyer hinted they might accept the revised terms if we're willing to make a portion payable immediately to facilitate the transition. Translation: Richard needed cash, and he needed it now. I considered the request as I sat on my lakeside patio, watching the stars emerge above the water. Making an immediate payment wasn't ideal for cash flow during the expansion, but it would accelerate Richard's exit from my business life. Counter with 10% up front, remainder over 7 years, I texted back. Contingent on comprehensive release of all claims and non-disparagement agreement. Sarah's response was immediate. Perfect. We'll communicate tomorrow. I set my phone aside, feeling the weight of the past weeks beginning to lift slightly. The path forward was becoming clearer. Lake Sapphire would survive Richard's attempted raid. I would protect what I'd built. But as I sipped my wine in the peaceful evening, a new question began forming in my mind. Richard's desperate grab for money suggested his new life with Amber wasn't proceeding as smoothly as he'd anticipated. What exactly was happening in that relationship? And how might it factor into our ongoing chess match? The answers would prove more consequential than I could have imagined. The next morning, I arrived at the resort earlier than usual, eager to check on the security upgrades Jason and the IT team had implemented. The lakeside fog was just lifting, casting an ethereal glow over the grounds as I walked from the parking area. "Morning, Ms. Ellison," called Eduardo, one of our groundskeepers who always started his shift at dawn. "Beautiful day coming." I smiled, pausing to chat briefly about the new landscaping around the spa building. These moments, connecting with staff who took genuine pride in the resort, always centered me, reinforcing why the long hours and current stress were worthwhile. As I approached the main building, I noticed an unfamiliar car in the staff parking area, a dented Honda Civic that had seen better days, probably belonging to a new hire in housekeeping or food service. In the lobby, the overnight manager was preparing to hand over to the day team, the transition as smooth and choreographed as a well-rehearsed dance. I greeted the staff, accepted a freshly brewed coffee from the barista at our small cafe, and continued to my office. The morning unfolded with routine efficiency, reviewing occupancy reports, addressing minor maintenance issues, and finalizing details for an upcoming wedding. By mid-morning, I was deep in financial projections for the next quarter when Janet appeared in my doorway, her expression unusually hesitant. "Ms. Ellison, there's a situation I think you should be aware of." I looked up, immediately alert. What kind of situation? Janet glanced over her shoulder, then stepped fully into my office, closing the door behind her. It's about Mr. Ellison, she said quietly. He's applied for a position here. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. Excuse me? A position, Janet repeated. With the resort, the assistant groundskeeper opening. He submitted an application yesterday through our online system. For a moment, I was speechless. Richard, who considered manual labor beneath him, who complained when asked to carry groceries from the car, applying to be an assistant groundskeeper. That's unexpected, I finally managed. Janet nodded, her professional composure briefly giving way to bewilderment. Human Resources flagged it immediately, of course. Under normal circumstances, they wouldn't even consider an application from an owner's estranged spouse, but given the ongoing legal situation, they wanted direction, I finished for her. I understand. The situation was bizarre enough that my first instinct was to dismiss it as some kind of mistake or prank. But recalling Richard's increasingly desperate financial maneuvers, I had to consider the possibility that this was genuine. Let me see the application, I requested. Janet handed me a tablet with the HR system open. There it was. Richard's name, contact information, and a hastily assembled resume emphasizing his extensive knowledge of Lake Sapphire's operations and grounds. The desired salary was listed at just above minimum wage. Has he been contacted yet? I asked. No, ma'am. HR wanted your input first, given the circumstances. I considered my options. Legally, I couldn't reject his application solely because he was my soon-to-be ex-husband. That would potentially create ammunition for his claims of unfair treatment. But surely there were legitimate business reasons to decline his application. Is Eduardo still scheduled to conduct the groundskeeper interviews? I asked. Janet nodded. Yes, tomorrow morning. Eduardo, our head groundskeeper, was both exceptionally skilled and utterly unimpressed by status or wealth. His assessments of candidates were based entirely on their knowledge, work ethic, and genuine interest in landscaping. Richard would fail spectacularly under Eduardo's evaluation. Process the application normally, I decided. Let Eduardo interview him alongside the other candidates. But inform security that Richard has an authorized visit scheduled and he is to remain in public areas only. Janet looked relieved to have clear direction. Yes, ma'am. Should I inform Eduardo about the situation? I considered this briefly. Just tell him that one candidate has prior knowledge of the resort, but no professional landscaping experience. I trust his judgment. After Janet left, I sat back in my chair, trying to make sense of this development. Why would Richard, proud, status-conscious Richard, apply for a groundskeeper position at my resort? The salary wouldn't begin to support his lifestyle or impress his young girlfriend. Unless, the realization hit me suddenly. Richard wasn't actually seeking employment. He was trying to create evidence for his lawsuit, attempting to demonstrate his commitment to the business and willingness to work from the ground up to protect his investment. It was theater, pure and simple. A performance designed to impress a judge or mediator with his dedication while painting me as vindictive if I rejected his application. I almost had to admire the calculation, even as I recognized the desperation behind it. Richard was running, out of options and resources. This pathetic gambit suggested he was truly backed into a corner. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Then I remembered his cruel dismissal of my contributions, his affair with a woman barely out of college, his attempt to claim half of what I'd built through years of sacrifice and determination. The sympathy evaporated, replaced by cool resolve. Let him play his game. Lake Sapphire operated on merit, not manipulation. If Richard wanted to subject himself to Eduardo's notoriously rigorous assessment process, he was welcome to the experience. I returned to my financial projections, a small smile playing at the corners of my mouth. Richard had no idea what he was walking into, and for once, I had no intention of warning him. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their actions, especially when those consequences involve Eduardo's legendary practical assessment of groundskeeping candidates. I couldn't wait to hear how Richard would fare when faced with actual work. He showed up in loafers, Eduardo reported the following afternoon, his weathered face creased with bemused disbelief. Loafers and pressed khakis. For a groundskeeping interview. I managed to maintain my professional composure, though inwardly, I was struggling not to laugh at the image. How did the interview proceed? Eduardo shook his head, setting his muddy work boots carefully on the mat beside my office door. I treat all candidates the same, Ms. Ellison. Theory questions first, then the practical assessment. The practical assessment was Eduardo's trademark, a hands-on demonstration of basic groundskeeping tasks that quickly separated those with genuine experience from those who merely claimed it on resumes. And, I prompted, the man couldn't identify. Basic irrigation components, Eduardo said, his tone suggesting this was akin to not recognizing one's own reflection. When I asked about seasonal fertilization approaches, he said, and I quote, "Whatever gets the job done fastest." This time I couldn't suppress a small smile. I see. And the practical assessment? Eduardo's expression shifted to something between amusement and disbelief. He refused at first. Said he was more of a strategic thinker and would oversee rather than execute once hired. The groundskeeper shook his head. I explained that all candidates must demonstrate basic competencies. Eventually, he agreed to try the hedge trimming. Could imagine Richard's horror at being asked to perform manual labor as part of a job interview. His carefully manicured hands had likely never held gardening tools before. The results were... Eduardo paused diplomatically. Not satisfactory. When I suggested he might be better suited to a different role, he became quite agitated. Insisted he had extensive resort experience at the highest levels, and that I was failing to recognize executive talent. How did you respond? I asked, genuinely curious about Eduardo's handling of the situation. I told him gardening requires patience, attention to detail, and respect for nature's rhythms. Eduardo replied with simple dignity. Executive experience is valuable in the boardroom, perhaps, but the earth responds only to those who understand her needs. His philosophical response, so characteristic of the man who had transformed our grounds into award-winning gardens, made me smile again. Eduardo saw his work as both art and stewardship, a perspective Richard could never comprehend. Thank you for conducting the interview properly, I said. I appreciate your professionalism, especially given the unusual circumstances. Eduardo nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Ellison is not suited for groundskeeping, Ms. Ellison, but if I may speak freely? Of course. He seems a man in need of meaningful work. There is honor in labor, in creating something with one's hands. Perhaps that is what he is seeking, beneath the fine clothes and proud words. Eduardo's compassionate interpretation gave me pause. Was it possible Richard's application represented something more than a legal maneuver? Could he genuinely be searching for purpose after the collapse of his marriage and self-image? I considered this perspective as Eduardo took his leave, returning to the gardens he tended with such care. The possibility that Richard might be experiencing genuine regret or existential crisis was more complicated than the straightforward narrative of manipulation I'd assumed. Still, regardless of his motivations, Richard had failed the interview on merit, exactly as our hiring process was designed to work. I called Sarah to update her on this latest development. So he's trying to get his foot back in the door, she concluded after hearing about the interview. Classic maneuver. He wants to establish ongoing involvement with the business to strengthen his ownership claims. That was my first thought, I admitted. But Eduardo suggested there might be more to it, that Richard might actually be searching for meaningful work. Sarah's skeptical silence spoke volumes. I know, I acknowledged. It seems unlikely given everything we know about him. But people sometimes surprise us when their backs are against the wall. Well, either way, Sarah said practically, he failed the interview legitimately. If he claims discrimination, you have Eduardo's assessment to back up the decision. And speaking of backing up decisions, I heard from Richard's lawyer this morning. I straightened in my chair. And? They've countered at 12.5%, with 15% payable up front. Clearly, he needs cash now. This confirmed my suspicions about Richard's financial situation. He was compromising on his overall demand to secure immediate payment. Is the non-disparagement clause included? I asked. Yes, along with confidentiality provisions and a complete release of all business claims. It's actually quite favorable, Claire. I recommend we accept. I considered the terms. The upfront payment would be substantial, over $1 million based on current valuation, but would finally sever Richard's claims to Lake Sapphire. The business could move forward without his shadow looming over every decision. Draft the acceptance, I agreed. But I want one addition. What's that? Sarah asked. A provision explicitly barring him from seeking employment at Lake Sapphire or any of its subsidiaries for a period of 5 years. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering my request. That's unusual, but not unreasonable given the circumstances. I'll add it to the counteroffer. She paused. You really think he'd try again after the groundskeeper fiasco? I think Richard is unpredictable right now, I replied, gazing out at the lake where afternoon sunlight danced across the water. And I want this chapter closed completely. After hanging up, I returned to the quarterly projections, but my mind kept drifting to Eduardo's philosophical assessment of Richard. Was my ex-husband truly searching for meaning? Or was this another calculated move in our ongoing chess match? The question lingered as I moved through my afternoon meetings. By evening, when I finally left the office, I'd pushed it aside in favor of more pressing concerns: the West Wing construction timeline, summer staffing projections, and preliminary menu planning for our busy season. The following morning brought unexpected news. Sarah called just as I was arriving at the resort, her tone uncharacteristically urgent. Richard's been evicted, she announced without preamble. Apparently, he stopped paying rent on the apartment he shared with Amber. I paused beside my car, the resort's morning bustle momentarily forgotten. Evicted? When? Yesterday. My contact at the county clerk's office spotted the filing and gave me a heads up. They had 48 hours to vacate. Where are they staying? Asked, unsure why I even cared. That's the interesting part, Sarah replied. They've separated. Amber moved in with a friend. Richard's whereabouts are currently unknown. The information settled uncomfortably in my chest. Despite everything, the image of Richard, homeless, abandoned by his mistress, stirred unexpected emotions. Not sympathy exactly, but a strange sense of hollowness where satisfaction should have been. What about our settlement? I asked, refocusing on practicalities. His lawyer still expects to finalize terms this week. Apparently, Richard's financial situation hasn't affected his legal representation. Sarah's tone suggested this surprised her. I'll keep you posted. After hanging up, I remained beside my car for several minutes, processing this development. Richard's life appeared to be unraveling with remarkable speed. The man who had walked out of our marriage with such confident entitlement was now essentially homeless, his young girlfriend gone, his financial reserves presumably depleted. It was the outcome I should have wanted, a natural consequence of his choices. Yet I found no joy in it. With a sigh, I gathered my thoughts and continued into the resort. Whatever Richard's circumstances, my responsibilities remained the same. The business needed my full attention, especially with the summer season approaching and construction, deadlines looming. 3 days passed without further news of Richard. The settlement negotiations continued through our lawyers, minor details adjusted, language refined. I immersed myself in work, grateful for the structured demands of running a luxury resort. On the 4th day, As I was conducting a final walkthrough of our newly renovated spa facilities with the project manager, Janet appeared with an unusually hesitant expression. "Ms. Ellison, there's a situation that requires your attention." Something in her tone made me immediately alert. "What kind of situation?" Janet glanced at the project manager, then back to me. "It's personal. If you have a moment?" I excused myself from the walkthrough and followed Janet to a quiet corner of the spa reception area. "Richard is in the lobby," she said quietly. "He's asking to speak with you. He looks unwell." A flicker of alarm went through me. "Unwell? How?" "Disheveled. Tired." Janet chose her words carefully. "Security is monitoring, but he's not being disruptive. He simply asked to see you, said it was important." I considered my options. The settlement was nearly finalized. Meeting with Richard directly could potentially complicate matters. On the other hand, his appearance at the resort in a visibly distressed state could create a scene that would be more problematic. "I'll see him," I decided. "Have Paul escort him to conference room B, not my office. Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. Janet nodded, clearly relieved to have clear direction, and departed to convey my instructions. I took a moment to compose myself, then called Sarah. "Richard's here," I explained succinctly. "I'm going to hear what he wants, but I wanted you, aware in case this impacts our negotiations." "Be careful," Sarah cautioned. "Don't agree to anything without consulting me first. And consider having a witness present." "Security will be nearby," I assured her. "I'll call you immediately after." After hanging up, I checked my appearance in one of the spa's elegant mirrors, straightened my blazer, and headed toward the main building with purposeful strides. Whatever Richard wanted, I would maintain professional composure and clear boundaries. When I entered Conference Room B, a small but well-appointed space we used for private business meetings, I was nevertheless unprepared for the sight that greeted me. Richard sat at the polished conference table, his normally immaculate appearance in shocking disarray. His designer shirt was wrinkled, his face unshaven, dark circles prominent beneath his eyes. He looked up as I entered, a fleeting expression of relief crossing his haggard features. "Claire," he said, starting to rise. "Thank you for—" "Stay seated," I interrupted, maintaining a safe distance as I closed the door behind me. "What do you want, Richard?" He sank back into the chair, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I'm sorry to come here like this. I know I'm not supposed to be on the property." "Yet here you are," I observed coolly, remaining standing. "Why?" Richard took a deep breath. "I need help." The simple admission hung in the air between us. 3 words I'd never expected to hear from my proud, self-sufficient ex-husband. "What kind of help?" I asked cautiously. "A job," he replied, his voice rougher than I remembered. "Any position, anything at all." I stared at him, searching for signs this was another manipulation. "We've been through this. You failed the groundskeeper interview, and our settlement explicitly prohibits your employment here." "The settlement isn't finalized," Richard pointed out. "And I'm not asking for an executive position. I'll do anything. Maintenance, housekeeping, kitchen work." "Why?" I demanded, my suspicion growing. "Why are you so determined to work here specifically?" Richard's gaze dropped to the table. "Because I have nowhere else to go," he admitted quietly. "No one will hire me." "That's hard to believe," I replied skeptically. "You have decades of real estate experience." He laughed bitterly. "My real estate license expired 6 months ago. I was too distracted to renew it. And now my references are all checking my recent work, or lack thereof, at Lake Sapphire. That still doesn't explain why you need to work here. There are other hotels, other businesses." Richard looked up, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Because I know this place. Because despite everything, I did care about it. And because— He hesitated, then finished in a rush. Because I need to prove to myself that I can actually contribute something real. I crossed my arms, maintaining my defensive posture. What happened to Amber? The question clearly caught him off guard. She left, he said simply. When the money ran out, so did she. Turns out I was just a meal ticket and a place to stay. The irony was almost too perfect. Richard, who had abandoned me for a younger model, now himself abandoned when his resources dried up. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, the words automatic rather than heartfelt. But your personal circumstances don't change our business situation. I know, he acknowledged, shoulders slumping, slightly. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I behaved terribly. I tried to take credit for your work. I betrayed you in every possible way. He looked up, his expression earnest. But I'm asking anyway. Give me a chance to prove I can actually work, actually contribute. The lowest position, the worst shift, anything. I studied him carefully, trying to reconcile this humbled figure with the arrogant man who had demanded half my business mere weeks ago. Why should I believe this isn't another legal maneuver? Another attempt to establish your connection to the resort? Because I'm willing to sign whatever legal waiver you want, he replied promptly, acknowledging that employment creates no ownership interest, no rights to the business. I just need work, Claire. Meaningful work. Eduardo's words echoed in my mind. He seems a man in need of meaningful work. There is honor in labor, in creating something with one's hands. I considered my options carefully. The settlement was nearly complete. Richard's desperation suggested he would accept the terms regardless of my decision about employment. From a business perspective, there was no advantage to hiring him, only potential complications and awkwardness. And yet, if, and this is a significant if, I were to consider this, I said slowly, what makes you think you could handle physical labor? You've never shown any interest or aptitude for it before. Richard's response was surprisingly candid. I don't know that I can, he admitted. But I need to try. The past month has been educational. I've realized how little I actually know how to do. How dependent I've been on others, on you, to create stability and comfort. His self-awareness, however belated, was unexpected. I found myself marginally less skeptical. Let me be very clear, I said, making a decision I hoped wouldn't prove foolish. The settlement remains as negotiated, 12.5%, with the employment prohibition clause removed. In exchange, you would be eligible to apply for entry-level positions only, with absolutely no preferential treatment. Hope flickered across his exhausted features. I understand. You'd be subject to the same performance standards as any employee, I continued firmly. The first complaint, the first missed shift, the first hint of you leveraging our past relationship, and you're terminated immediately. No second chances. That's fair, he agreed. And, I added the crucial point, you would sign a separate legal agreement confirming that your employment creates no ownership interest, no management rights, and no claim to intellectual property or business goodwill. Richard nodded quickly. I'll sign whatever you need. I studied him for a long moment, still searching for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. What I saw instead was something I'd never witnessed in our years together, genuine humility. I'll speak with HR, I said finally. There's a housekeeping position opening next week. Entry-level overnight shift with 3 months probation. If you're serious, that's what's available. Relief washed over his face. Thank you, Claire. I mean it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, I warned him. This isn't charity. You'll be expected to perform to our standards. Lake Sapphire's reputation depends on every staff member doing their job exceptionally well. I understand, he repeated, straightening slightly. I won't let you down. As I left the conference room, instructing security to escort Richard out, I questioned my own judgment. Was I being manipulated yet again? Or was I witnessing genuine transformation born from adversity? Either way, I had just opened a door I wasn't entirely sure I should have unlocked. "You did what?" Sarah exclaimed later that afternoon when I called to update her on my meeting with Richard. "Claire, we had him cornered." "The settlement terms remain essentially the same," I reminded her. "I simply removed the employment prohibition." "Because he batted his eyelashes and played the homeless card," Sarah replied skeptically. "This is exactly how he's manipulated you for years." Her blunt assessment stung, but I couldn't entirely dismiss it. "I'm aware of the risks," I said carefully. "But I'm not offering him an executive position or decision-making authority. He'll be cleaning rooms on the overnight shift, if he even lasts through training." Sarah sighed, her frustration evident even through the phone. "It's your business," she conceded, "but I want additional protections in the employment agreement. Specific clauses about confidentiality, non-solicitation of clients, non-disparagement." "Absolutely," I agreed. "Draw it up as tight as legally possible." After hanging up, I gazed out my office window at the lake, its surface rippled by a gentle afternoon breeze. Had I made a mistake? Was I falling back into old patterns, allowing Richard's needs to override my better judgment? No, I decided. This wasn't the same. The key difference was power. I now held it completely while Richard had none. His employment would be conditional, probationary, and governed by the same standards. Applied to all staff. If he failed to perform or attempted to leverage our history, he would be terminated immediately. And perhaps more importantly, there was a certain poetic justice in Richard cleaning rooms in the resort he had once casually claimed credit for, building. If he truly wanted to understand the business from the ground up, scrubbing toilets and changing sheets at 3 a.m. would certainly provide that education. The settlement was finalized 3 days later. Richard accepted all terms without further negotiation, including the comprehensive employment agreement Sarah had crafted. The initial payment was transferred to his account, legally severing his claims to Lake Sapphire once and for all. "Signed everything without a single objection," Sarah reported, sounding almost disappointed to be deprived of a fight. "Either he's truly desperate, or he's playing an extremely long game. Let's assume the former, but prepare for the latter," I replied pragmatically. Richard was scheduled to begin orientation the following Monday. I had instructed HR to treat him exactly like any new hire. No special accommodations, no adjusted expectations. He would attend the standard new employee training, learn our protocols and standards, and be assigned to the overnight housekeeping team reporting to Magdalena, our most exacting supervisor. Throughout the week leading up to his start date, I deliberately immersed myself in the expansion project, spending long hours with contractors and designers, reviewing plans for the new guest wing. I told myself it was necessary focus, not avoidance of the unusual situation I'd created. On Monday morning, I arrived at the resort earlier than usual, ostensibly to review the weekend's performance metrics, but actually curious whether Richard would show up for his 7 a.m. orientation. As I passed through the training room corridor, I glanced in to see him already seated, dressed in the simple black slacks and white shirt required for orientation, a resort logo notebook open before him. Our eyes met briefly through the glass. Panel in the door. He nodded respectfully. I continued walking without acknowledging him. Later that day, Magdalena stopped by my office for our scheduled housekeeping department review. "We have the new overnight hire starting training with us tomorrow," she noted, reviewing her staffing chart. "Richard Ellison, any special instructions?" I appreciated her direct approach. Magdalena had been with Lake Sapphire for 8 years, rising from line staff to supervisor through exceptional dedication and attention to detail. She was also refreshingly straightforward. "No special instructions," I replied. "Treat him exactly like any other new hire. Same training, same expectations, Same consequences for not meeting standards. Magdalena studied me for a moment, her experienced eyes missing nothing. He shares your last name, she observed neutrally. He's my ex-husband, I confirmed, deciding honesty was the best approach with someone I respected and relied upon. Our divorce was recently finalized. His employment here is complicated, but he's entitled to the same fair chance as anyone else, no better, no worse. To her credit, Magdalena simply nodded, making a small note in her planner. Understood. We're short-staffed on overnights, so if he works well, that's what matters to my team. Exactly, I agreed, grateful for her professionalism. Results are what count. Over the next week, I received regular updates through the normal management channels about the new employee orientation cohort. Richard was completing the required training modules, attending the scheduled sessions, and generally meeting expectations. Nothing exceptional, nothing problematic, simply adequate performance. This, in itself, represented a significant change from his previous approach to work. In all our years together, Richard had either excelled dramatically, when motivated by recognition or reward, or disengaged completely, when tasks seemed beneath him. Consistent, reliable mediocrity was entirely new territory. On Friday afternoon, as I was reviewing vendor contracts in my office, a knock at the door interrupted my concentration. "Come in," I called, expecting Janet with the weekend event schedule. Instead, Jason entered, carrying a maintenance report. "Got a minute?" he asked, his expression suggesting this wasn't a routine matter. "Of course," I replied, setting aside my work. "What's up?" Jason closed the door behind him, then sat in the visitor's chair. "I ran into your ex-husband today." He was shadowing Eduardo around the boiler room as part of orientation. I maintained a neutral expression. And nothing problematic, Jason assured me quickly. He was respectful, paid attention. But it was strange. Seeing him in that context. I nodded, understanding Jason's discomfort. "It's an unusual situation. If it makes you uncomfortable." "It's not that," Jason interrupted. "I'm just concerned about you, Claire. This can't be easy." His genuine concern touched me more than I wanted to admit. "I'm fine," I assured him. "This is a business decision. We're short-staffed, he needed work. The legal protections are in place." Jason nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. "As long as you're sure, just be careful. People don't usually change that dramatically without reason." "Believe me, I'm proceeding with caution," I replied. "But I appreciate your concern. It means a lot." After Jason left, I found myself reflecting on his warning. Was I being naive? Was Richard's apparent transformation simply another manipulation tactic? Time would tell. And in the meantime, I had a resort to run. Richard completed his orientation the following week and officially joined the overnight housekeeping team. Per my instructions, management provided the same brief updates on his performance they would for any new employee during the probationary period: satisfactory attendance, meeting basic standards, no significant issues or commendations. I deliberately maintained my distance, neither seeking details about his work nor avoiding the parts of the resort where he might be working. Lake Sapphire operated 24/7, with different teams seamlessly transitioning throughout the day and night. Our paths rarely crossed naturally. 3 weeks into Richard's employment, Magdalena requested a meeting outside our regular schedule. She arrived at my office precisely on time, her neatly pressed uniform and practical shoes reflecting her no-nonsense approach. "Thank you for making time," she began, settling into the visitor's chair with perfect posture. "I wanted to discuss Richard Ellison's performance." I braced myself, unsure whether to expect a complaint or a complication. "Has there been an issue?" "On the contrary," Magdalena replied, consulting her small notebook. he's exceeded expectations. In several areas. This was not what I had anticipated. In what way? Attention to detail, for one, she said, reviewing her notes. His rooms consistently pass inspection on the first review. He's also shown initiative in addressing minor maintenance issues rather than simply reporting them, tightening loose fixtures, addressing simple plumbing issues. That's unexpected, I admitted. Magdalena nodded in agreement. I was skeptical, given the circumstances of his hiring, but he works hard, doesn't complain about the less pleasant aspects of the job, and has been respectful to all team members. She glanced up from her notes. It's unusual to see this level of performance from someone who... She hesitated. Who comes from a different background? I supplied. Exactly. Most people with no housekeeping experience struggle with the physical demands and attention to detail required. He had a difficult adjustment period, but persevered. She tapped her notebook thoughtfully. I thought you should know, as we're approaching the end of his first month. Thank you for the update, I said, processing this unexpected information. Has he mentioned our prior relationship to anyone? Not that I'm aware of, Magdalena replied. He maintains appropriate professional boundaries. If anything, he seems especially careful to avoid any appearance of special treatment. After she left, I sat quietly for several minutes, contemplating this development. Richard, performing well in a physically demanding, detail-oriented role most would consider beneath his experience and education. Richard, maintaining professional boundaries and appropriate workplace behavior. It defied my expectations entirely. That evening, as I walked the property during sunset, a personal tradition that helped me maintain connection to the guest experience, I found myself near the staff entrance as the overnight team arrived for their shift. From a discreet distance, I observed Richard among them, dressed in the standard housekeeping uniform, carrying the same equipment bag as his colleagues. He was engaged in conversation with an older woman on his team, listening attentively as she gestured expressively. Nothing in his demeanor suggested condescension or impatience, qualities I'd observed in him countless times when dealing with service workers during our marriage. The Richard I had known would never have tolerated such a position, much less excelled in it. Had the humbling experiences of recent months truly transformed him? Or was this elaborate performance designed to achieve some hidden agenda? As the team disappeared into the service entrance, I continued my evening walk, troubled by questions I couldn't yet answer. A month later, those questions remained largely unresolved. Richard continued his satisfactory performance on the overnight housekeeping team. Magdalena reported that he had begun cross-training in laundry services and basic room service preparation, standard development for promising staff members. I maintained my professional distance, receiving regular updates through normal management channels, but never directly interacting with him in the workplace. Our lives had become a strange parallel existence, sharing the same physical space but occupying entirely different worlds within it. On a particularly busy Friday, as I was rushing between meetings, I literally collided with Richard in a service corridor. He was pushing a linen cart. I was checking text messages while walking. The impact sent my phone clattering to the floor. "I'm so sorry," he said immediately, kneeling to retrieve it. "I should have watched where—" He broke off as he looked up, recognition dawning. "Claire." "Richard," I acknowledged, accepting the phone he handed back. "My fault. I wasn't paying attention." An awkward silence fell between us, our first face-to-face encounter since his hiring. Up close, I noticed subtle changes in his appearance. He'd lost weight, his face more angular than I remembered. The designer haircut had grown out, replaced by something simpler and more practical. His hands, once meticulously manicured, showed the effects of manual labor, slightly roughened, with clean but trimmed nails. "How are you?" he asked finally, his tone cautious but seemingly genuine. "Busy," I replied automatically. "The summer season is ramping up, and with construction ongoing—" He nodded, a flash of the old Richard emerging as he commented, "The expansion looks impressive. The foundation work is proceeding faster than the East Wing did." "Different contractor," I explained briefly, then wondered why I was bothering to discuss business details with my housekeeper ex-husband. "I should get to my next meeting." "Of course," he said quickly, stepping aside with the linen cart. "Have a good day, Ms. Ellison." The formal address, so different from his once casual use of my name, caught me off guard. But it was appropriate, I reminded myself. Professional. A recognition of our changed relationship. "Thank you," I replied, simply continuing on my way with deliberate steps that betrayed none of my inner confusion. That brief encounter lingered in my thoughts throughout the day. Richard had seemed genuinely different, humbler, more self-aware, less entitled. The question remained, was the change real or strategic? Later that evening, I found myself reviewing employee performance metrics for the quarterly management meeting. Richard's name appeared in the housekeeping section, his performance statistics impressively consistent. Magdalena had added a comment, recommending him for cross-training in additional departments due to his reliability and attention to detail. On impulse, I pulled up his employment file. His emergency contact information caught my eye. No longer Amber or his mother, but simply none. His current address was listed as a weekly rate motel in town, the kind of place usually inhabited by transient workers or those between housing situations. Despite myself, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Richard had fallen far from his aspirations of luxury and status. Yet according to all reports, he was accepting his new reality with unexpected grace and diligence. A knock at my office door interrupted these reflections. Jason entered, carrying blueprints for the new staff housing project. "Got the updated plans from the architect," he announced, spreading them across my desk. "They've incorporated the solar heating system you wanted." As we reviewed the modifications, I found myself distracted. Jason's earlier warning about Richard's dramatic change echoing in my thoughts. "Something wrong with the designs?" Jason asked, noticing my inattention. "No, they're perfect," I assured him. "I'm just distracted. It's been a long day." Jason studied me thoughtfully. "How's it going with your ex-husband working here? Any problems?" "Surprisingly, no," I admitted. "He's performing well by all accounts. It's just strange." Jason nodded understandingly. People can change when their circumstances force them to. The question is whether the change is temporary or meaningful. His insight resonated with my own concerns. Exactly. Is this genuine growth or just adaptation? Until he finds a better option? "Time will tell," Jason replied pragmatically. "In the meantime, you've given someone a chance to prove themselves. That's not a bad thing, regardless of your history." His perspective was refreshing. Neither suspicious like Sarah's nor naively optimistic, but practically compassionate. Perhaps that was the approach I needed to adopt myself. "You're right," I acknowledged. "I'm overthinking it. He's just one employee among many." Jason smiled slightly. "An employee with a rather unique perspective on the boss. But yes." After Jason left, I returned to the performance metrics, making notes for the management meeting. Whatever Richard's motives, his presence was meeting a business need during our staffing shortage. That was what mattered professionally. If I occasionally wondered about the personal implications of his transformation, that was a separate issue entirely, one I wasn't yet ready to address. 2 weeks later, a situation arose that forced me to confront those unexamined questions. I was reviewing the overnight incident reports, a routine morning task, when an entry caught my attention. 217, guest medical emergency, room 342. First responder, R. Ellison, housekeeping. Guest experiencing chest pains. Emergency protocols followed, ambulance called. Paramedics arrived 0231. Guest transported to Lake County Hospital. Follow-up required. According to the detailed notes, Richard had been cleaning nearby rooms when he heard calls for help. He'd responded immediately, administered basic first aid, directed another staff member to call emergency services, and remained with the distressed guest until paramedics arrived. The overnight manager had added a commendation. Note: staff member Ellison demonstrated exceptional judgment and calm under pressure. Guest's wife specifically mentioned his reassuring presence during a frightening situation. I set the report aside, unexpectedly moved by this glimpse of Richard responding with compassion and competence to a crisis. This wasn't the calculated charm he'd deployed in business settings throughout our marriage, but genuine human care in a moment of need. Later that morning, I called the hospital to check on the guest, learning he was stable and expected to make a full recovery. When I spoke with his wife to offer the resort's assistance, she specifically mentioned the kind gentleman from housekeeping who had helped during the emergency. He was so calm, she told me, kept reassuring both of us while checking my husband's pulse and helping him into a position that made breathing easier. Said he'd had some emergency response training years ago. Made all the difference while we waited for the ambulance. After the call, I sat thoughtfully at my desk. The emergency response training she mentioned had been a course Richard had reluctantly attended with me during our second year of marriage, something I'd insisted on for all management staff. At the time, he'd complained it was unnecessary for his role. Yet he'd remembered the training when it mattered most. That afternoon, I did something I had carefully avoided for months. I sought Richard out directly. After confirming with Magdalena that he was performing inventory in the main housekeeping supply room, I made my way through the service corridors to find him. He was counting sheet sets when I entered, clipboard in hand, completely absorbed in his task. He looked up at the padi sound of the door, surprise flickering across his features when he saw me. "Ms. Ellison," he acknowledged, straightening. "Can I help you with something?" I read the incident report from last night, I said without preamble. "The guest in room 342. Richard nodded, his expression growing serious. "Mr. Hartnett, is he all right?" "He's stable," I confirmed. "Expected to recover fully. His wife specifically mentioned how helpful you were during the emergency." A slight flush colored Richard's cheeks. "I just followed protocols. Anyone would have done the same. Nevertheless, you handled the situation exceptionally well. The resort appreciates your quick thinking." An awkward silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken questions and acknowledgments. Richard shifted slightly, clearly uncertain how to respond to praise from his ex-wife and current employer. "I remember that emergency response course," he said finally. "The one you made all of us take when we first opened the East Wing. I complained about it at the time, but—" He shrugged slightly. "Turned out to be useful after all." The simple acknowledgement that I had been right about something he had dismissed seemed momentous coming from the man who had spent years subtly undermining my decisions while taking credit for my successes. "Yes," I agreed quietly. "It did." Another silence stretched between us, less awkward but more complex. "Is there anything else you need?" Richard asked finally, his tone respectful but not subservient. I hesitated, suddenly aware I had no professional reason to prolong this conversation. "No, that's all. Thank you again for your quick response last night." As I turned to leave, Richard spoke again. "Claire?" I paused, looking back. "Yes?" "I've been meaning to say," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "The New West? Wing design is impressive. The way you've integrated it with the natural landscape while maximizing lake views. It's going to be spectacular." The compliment was unexpectedly genuine, acknowledging my vision rather than claiming shared credit. "Thank you," I replied simply. As I walked away, I realized Richard's transformation might be more complex, and perhaps more genuine, than I had allowed myself to believe. The question remaining was what, if anything, that meant for our future interactions. For now, I decided it meant exactly what I'd told him, a professional acknowledgement of work well done. Nothing more, nothing less. But later that night, as I sat on my lakeside patio watching moonlight dance across the water, I found myself wondering whether people truly could change fundamentally, or whether they simply revealed different aspects of themselves under different circumstances, and which possibility was more unsettling when applied to the man I had once loved, then hated, and now viewed with complicated uncertainty. The quarterly management meeting the following week brought together department heads from across the resort. As we assembled in the executive conference room, laptops and reports spread across the polished table, I noticed Magdalena checking her phone with a worried expression. "Everything all right?" I asked as we prepared to begin. "Minor staffing issue," she replied quietly. 3 overnight housekeepers called in sick. Possible food poisoning from a restaurant in town. We're scrambling to cover the shifts. I nodded sympathetically. Staffing challenges were a constant in the hospitality industry, particularly during peak season. Let me know if you need resources from other departments. The meeting proceeded efficiently, each department presenting their quarterly results and upcoming projections. The resort was performing exceptionally well, with occupancy rates and revenue per available room significantly above industry averages. The expansion was on schedule and within budget. Staff satisfaction metrics showed improvement across all departments. By any objective measure, Lake Sapphire was thriving, validating my vision and leadership despite Richard's absence from the executive team. As we concluded the financial review portion, my phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Mr. Hartnett's wife is in the lobby with flowers for the housekeeping man who helped save my husband. Should I direct her to HR?" I considered briefly, then replied, "I'll handle it personally. Be there in 5. Excusing myself from the meeting during a short break, I headed to the lobby to find Mrs. Hartnett waiting with an elaborate floral arrangement. "Ms. Ellison," she greeted me warmly. "I was hoping to thank the young man who helped my husband personally." I smiled, appreciating her generous spirit while inwardly amused at her description of 45-year-old Richard as a young man. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hartnett. The staff member is currently on overnight shift, but I'd be happy to ensure he receives your gift and message." She handed me the flowers along with a card. "Please tell him Timothy is doing much better. The doctor said if he hadn't received help so quickly." She paused, emotion briefly overcoming her. "Well, let's just say we're very grateful. I'll make sure he knows," I promised. After Mrs. Hartnett departed, I stood in the lobby with the elaborate floral arrangement, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. Delivering a grateful guest's gift to a staff member would normally be handled through department channels. But given the unusual circumstances and the staffing shortage Magdalena had mentioned, perhaps a more direct approach was warranted. Making a decision, I headed to my office to leave the flowers with a note, instructing Janet to have them delivered to Richard at the beginning of his shift. Then I paused, reconsidering. The staffing shortage in housekeeping would impact service quality during a fully booked weekend. As resort owner, I had occasionally pitched in during emergencies, usually in management roles, but I understood the basics of all operations. An executive's willingness to help during crises typically boosted morale and demonstrated commitment to the team. Before I could overthink it, I texted Magdalena. "I heard about your staffing shortage. I'm available to help with overnight shift if needed." Her reply came almost immediately, surprise evident even through text. "Really? That would be incredibly helpful. We're 3 people short with full occupancy." "Put me where you need me," I responded. "I'll be there." Only after sending the message did I fully process the implications. I had just volunteered to work an overnight shift alongside my ex-husband, the man who had abandoned me for a younger woman, then ended up cleaning toilets in my hotel. Sarah would call it insanity. Jason would likely question my judgment, but something, curiosity perhaps, or a desire to fully understand the transformation I'd been observing from a distance, pushed me forward. That evening, at 11:30 p.m., I arrived at the staff entrance dressed in standard housekeeping attire, black slacks and a resort polo shirt. My hair was pulled back practically, my usual subtle makeup absent. I felt strangely vulnerable without my usual armor of tailored business wear. Magdalena met me in the staff room, surprise still evident in her expression despite our earlier communication. "Ms. Ellison, I can't thank you enough for this," she said, handing me a staff badge and equipment key. "We'll pair you with experienced staff so you're not handling anything too complicated." "Whatever helps most," I replied. "It's been a while since I made beds professionally, but I remember the basics." "We'll start you with Richard's section," she decided. "He's our most efficient overnight housekeeper, and the third floor needs special attention for a wedding group arriving tomorrow." Of course. The universe apparently had a sense of humor. "Fine," I agreed, maintaining a neutral expression. "I'll follow his lead." Magdalena led me to the service elevator, where Richard was already loading his cart. His double take upon seeing me was almost comical. "Ms. Ellison will be assisting due to our staffing shortage," Magdalena explained briskly. "Please show her current protocols and assign tasks appropriately." She turned to me. "Richard handles rooms 300 through 315, radio. If you need anything." After she departed, Richard and I stood in uncomfortable silence beside the housekeeping cart. "You're working overnight housekeeping," he finally stated, disbelief evident in his tone. "We're short-staffed," I replied simply. "Everyone pitches, enduring emergencies." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's start with supply inventory." For the next hour, Richard taught me current housekeeping protocols with surprising professionalism. No reference to our past, no awkward attempts at personal conversation, just clear instruction on the proper way to change linens, stock amenities, and clean bathrooms, according to Lake Sapphire's exacting standards. I found myself oddly impressed by his competence. The Richard I'd known had always delegated mundane tasks, claiming his talents were better used elsewhere. This Richard meticulously demonstrated the correct way to fold sheet corners and efficiently distribute cleaning supplies between rooms. "The key is minimizing trips to the cart," he explained, arranging supplies in a carrying caddy. "Saves about 20 minutes per section." As the night progressed, we fell into an unexpectedly effective rhythm. Richard took the bathrooms, the most technical cleaning task, while I handled beds and amenities. We moved methodically through the assigned rooms, working in companionable silence broken only by necessary communication. Around 2 a.m., during our scheduled break, we sat in the small staff lounge. I noticed Richard discreetly massaging his lower back, a subtle gesture I recognized from our marriage, typically emerging when stress or exhaustion accumulated. "How long did it take?" I asked, breaking our professional silence. "For your body to adjust to this work." He looked up, surprised by the personal question. "About 3 weeks," he admitted. "The first few shifts were humbling. I could barely move the next day." I nodded. After just 3 hours, my own back was protesting, unaccustomed to the repetitive bending and lifting. "Why did you keep going?" I asked, the question that had been lingering for months finally emerging. "You could have found easier work." Richard considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Pride, at first," he acknowledged. "I wanted to prove I could do it, especially after you gave me the chance despite everything." He paused, taking a sip of water. "But then something changed. There's a satisfaction in the work itself. Seeing immediate results. Knowing you've created comfort for someone, even if they never know who did it." The sentiment surprised me. So different from the status-driven man I'd known for years. "You've changed," I observed quietly. A small, self-deprecating smile crossed his features. Had to, eventually. Losing everything has a way of clarifying what matters. Our break ended, and we returned to work, the brief moment of personal connection receding as we focused on completing our assigned rooms. By the end of the shift, my respect for the housekeeping staff had increased exponentially. The physical demands alone were significant, but the attention to detail required was equally impressive. As we finished restocking our cart before handover to the morning team, Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. "Thank you," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "For what?" I asked. "For working alongside me tonight. You could have helped anywhere, but you chose to work with the ex-husband most people would rather avoid. It was where help was needed," I replied simply, though we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. He nodded, accepting the explanation without pressing further. "Well, thank you anyway. And—" he hesitated, then continued with quiet sincerity. "I'm sorry, Claire. For everything. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly sorry." The simple apology, delivered without excuses or expectations, caught me off guard. In all our negotiations and confrontations since his departure, Richard had expressed regret for consequences, but never genuine remorse for his actions. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, unsure how else to respond. We completed our shift in thoughtful silence, each processing the unexpected connection that had developed through shared work and purpose. 2 days later, I received Magdalena's regular performance report for the overnight team. She had included a special note. "Team dynamic between R. Ellison and yourself was exceptionally productive. Your section was completed 30 minutes ahead of schedule with 0 quality issues. Would you consider occasional shifts during staffing emergencies?" I smiled despite myself. The irony was almost too perfect. My ex-husband and I apparently made an excellent housekeeping team. After careful consideration, I replied that I would be available for emergency staffing needs in any department, including housekeeping. It was a practical business decision, I told myself. Nothing more. Over the next several weeks, I filled in for various departments during staffing shortages, mostly in supervisory roles, but occasionally in direct service positions. If Richard happened to be working the same shift, we maintained professional courtesy and efficient collaboration. Each interaction became marginally less awkward, our shared history gradually overshadowed by our current working relationship. 3. Months into this new dynamic, Jason approached me after a management meeting, his expression concerned. "People are talking," he said without preamble. "About?" I prompted, though I suspected I knew. "You and Richard," he replied. "The staff has noticed you working alongside him. There are speculations." I sighed, having anticipated this eventually. "What kind of speculations?" "Some think you're considering reconciliation," Jason said carefully. "Others believe you're monitoring him for some purpose. Either way, it's becoming a distraction." He was right, of course. In a small resort community, any unusual dynamic between the owner and a staff member, particularly an ex-husband, would inevitably generate gossip. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "I'll address it." That evening, I sent Richard an email, requesting a meeting the following day. We met in a small conference room, the professional setting establishing clear boundaries. "There's been talk," I explained straightforwardly. "About us working together." Richard nodded, unsurprised. "I've heard some of it." "It's becoming a distraction for the staff," I continued, "which means it's a business issue that needs addressing." "I understand," he said. "I can request transfer to another department if that would help." I considered this but shook my head. "You're performing well in your current role. Moving you would only fuel more speculation." I paused, considering options. "I think we need clarity, for ourselves and for the staff." "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "Honesty," I replied simply, "about our professional relationship and its boundaries." Richard studied me for a moment. And what exactly is our relationship at this point, Claire? The direct question deserved a direct answer. I don't know, I admitted. We're not just owner and employee. We're not friends exactly, but we're not merely ex-spouses either. No, he agreed quietly. We're something more complicated. The acknowledgement hung between us, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply true. I've been thinking about my next steps, Richard said after a moment. Magdalena suggested I consider applying for the assistant supervisor position opening in housekeeping next month. I nodded, aware of the planned promotion as our longtime night supervisor was retiring. You'd be qualified based on your performance. But it would complicate things further, he observed. Yes, I acknowledged. It would. We sat in thoughtful silence, the question of our future professional relationship hanging unresolved between us. Maybe we should stop being so careful around each other, Richard suggested finally. The staff is going to talk regardless. We might as well be authentic. Authentic how? I asked. By acknowledging our complicated history while focusing on our current professional relationship, he explained. No pretense that we're just random colleagues, but no drama either. The suggestion had merit. Attempting to ignore our history only created an artificial tension that fueled speculation. That's reasonable, I agreed. But there need to be clear boundaries. Absolutely. Richard nodded firmly. I'm not suggesting anything beyond professional communication and occasional civil conversation when work requires it. We established basic guidelines, transparent communication through proper channels, no special treatment or expectations, and a mutual commitment to prioritizing resort operations above personal history. As our meeting concluded, Richard paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm grateful for how this has turned out, he said quietly. Not just the job, though that saved me when I needed it most, but the chance to make amends through actions rather than words. I studied him thoughtfully. The man before me maintained Richard's features but displayed a humility and self-awareness I'd never witnessed during our marriage. You've earned your position here, I acknowledged. Whatever else has happened between us, that much is true. 6 months later, Richard was promoted to assistant supervisor in the housekeeping department based on merit and performance evaluations. By then, the resort staff had largely adjusted to our unusual professional dynamic. Occasional collaboration, without personal entanglement, civil interaction without forced friendliness. Our settlement had long since been finalized, the business legally protected from future claims. Richard continued living modestly in a small apartment near the resort, his lifestyle dramatically simplified from our married years. Though curiosity occasionally tempted me to inquire about his personal life, whether he'd maintained contact with Amber, how he spent his days off, I maintained the professional boundaries we'd established. Whatever transformation Richard had undergone was his own journey, not a narrative I needed to follow. Lake Sapphire thrived, its expansion completed. Ahead of schedule, its reputation for excellence growing. The staff housing project was fully operational, providing affordable living options for those who maintained our high standards of service. One evening, as I conducted my customary sunset walk along the lake, I encountered Richard sitting alone, on one of the guest benches, gazing out over the water. He'd clearly just finished his shift, still dressed in his supervisor's uniform, but with an air of quiet contemplation. Beautiful evening, I observed, pausing nearby. He looked up, nodding in agreement. The best time on the lake. I hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered since his transformation began. Are you happy, Richard? With how things turned out? He considered this thoughtfully. Not how I imagined my life would go, he admitted with a small smile. But yes, in a way I never expected. He gestured toward the resort behind us. There's satisfaction in being part of something worthwhile, even in a role I once would have considered beneath me. I nodded, understanding precisely what he meant. My own journey had taught me that true fulfillment came not from titles or recognition, but from creating something of genuine value. The difference, I observed, is that I always knew that. You had to lose everything to discover it. True, he acknowledged without defensiveness. Some lessons come at greater cost than others. We stood in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Not friends, not enemies, but two people who had traveled a complicated path to an unexpected destination. "Thank you," I said finally, "for proving me wrong." Richard looked up, surprised. "About what?" "I didn't believe people could truly change," I explained. "I thought your transformation was strategic, another manipulation." He nodded, accepting this without offense. "It was strategic at first," he admitted. "But then reality set in. Real work, real consequences, real learning." He shrugged slightly. The strategy became the truth. As I continued my walk along the lakeshore, leaving Richard to his sunset contemplation, I reflected on the strange journey we'd traveled. The man who had betrayed me now cleaned rooms and supervised staff in my resort. The woman he'd left me for had abandoned him when his resources dried up. The business he'd tried to claim had thrived under my sole leadership. It wasn't the neat revenge fantasy I might once have imagined, Richard suffering while I triumphantly flourished. Instead, it was something more complex and ultimately more satisfying. Two imperfect people finding their rightful places through difficult but necessary growth. He had learned humility and the value of honest work. I had learned to trust my judgment while allowing for the possibility of genuine change in others. And Lake Sapphire Resort continued its quiet prosperity, indifferent to our personal dramas, a testament to the vision that had sustained me through betrayal and beyond. Sometimes I reflected as the last light faded from the lake. The best revenge isn't punishment at all, but simply allowing life to rearrange everyone precisely where they belong. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.